Good afternoon. Welcome back to our afternoon session. We're just going to start our conversation with President Hay.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Guinness, in your lecture, you talked about the relationship between culture and civilization and how inspiration plays an important role in preserving civilization. Could you expand on that a little bit in terms of what you see both happening here and maybe in Britain as well, in terms of culture and the impact that it is having on civilization?
Well, let me say what a joy it is to be with you. We have a saying in Oxford, which is my home, that after lunch speaking is the art of speaking in somebody else's sleep. Often you'd go to something with Christopher Hitchens, and he'd bring a Perrier bottle, which looked like this, but in fact filled with Johnny Walker. So towards the end, he'd either be a little sleepy or a little worse for the weather. So I'm glad you've given me a nice glass. It's transparent.
It is Patrick Henry, after all.
No, but that's a very deep question, because today we've got to both appreciate and stand for what we believe is the inheritance of the West. So you think of all the glories of the West, Dante, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, Rembrandt, Bach, Mozart, and go on down the line. But what did the gospel do? I would boil it down to things like, first, the West was created by the conversion of barbarians. So the first great gift of the gospel was what historians have called the gentling of the European people. We Europeans, I'm European, you're European in background. We were barbarians. And as Heinrich Heine said famously, when you remove the taming talisman, which is what he called the cross, we're barbarians again. So, conversion, the gentling, and then the unity. Europe had incredible diversity, but the one thing that was united was Christendom. They were all members, in strange ways, of a Christian society. And then the third great thing, education. This is where, of course, they took over some of the classical Greek and Roman ideas, but the cathedral schools and the rise of the universities, a tremendous gift of the West to the world. The fourth thing I'd mention, which is what historians often point out, is the dynamism of the West. Unlike China, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the West has always been restless. And that's surely a gift of the gospel. And the idea that the status quo is never the full arrival of the kingdom. We're always pressing on. We're countercultural, not status quo. And so the West, unlike any other civilization, is characterized by this dynamism, this restless, not always good, but never absent. So those are the big things. Then you look at the truths of the gospel, how it shaped our sense of history, human dignity, freedom, and so on. They're all the gifts of the gospel.
Well, your point about restlessness is so good, and the words to an old hymn that our restless hearts find rest in you, right? There is this idea that we're made for another place, and this place isn't quite right.
Yeah.
And we have a role to play while we're here, right? So that's a very important role. So being able to look back and draw inspiration from that seems to be important in both the cohesion of a civilization, but also the advancement of a civilization. I think here in the United States especially, there's been sort of a move afoot to be ashamed of our history. Now, granted, there are things that are shameful in our history, but to throw it all out and say that it ought not have ever been is truly not a good place to start from a civilizational standpoint. How would you, based on your observations over the past few years, how would you comment on that?
Well, start biblically. Unlike, say, the Iliad, where the heroes of Greece and Rome are heroic and glorious, who's the greatest king in the Bible? an adulterer,
David.
and a murderer. There's no airbrushing of heroes. And that realism we ought to bring. So there's no question that slavery is America's tragedy, as sin and Genesis 3 were. And for me, I mean, in Europe, I'm an evangelical. In Europe, the evangelicals were on the side of the angels. The abolitionists were evangelicals. And there's no guilt. Whereas here, because of part of the South and the theological justification of slavery, a lot of Christians have a huge residual guilt. And that's a shame. We should unashamedly say that was terrible. The very moment the Christian abolitionists were reformists in Europe, Wilberforce pleaded with Jefferson. He pleaded with President Monroe. And they turned him down, and then came the cotton gin, and slavery was profitable, and you went forward to the Civil War, which was tragic in many ways. If only you'd listened to your Samuel Adamses and John Quincy Adams and so on. But we've got to be honest about it.
I think that's such an important thing to look
And the
at.
same with the Jews. You know, I was at a Jewish conference not recently, and they said something about civilization, and I said, very simply, and I thought it was very obvious, the biggest stain on the church in the whole of the West is the treatment of the Jewish people. And they flooded up to me afterwards. One man said, "You brought tears to my eyes just to hear a Christian say that." I mean, to me, it's very obvious. But we've got to be unapologetic. We're not gaslighting. No, there is forgiveness. Unlike us, you take the radical left who make everything of this and gaslight American history. Well, when you set up a conflict of powers, what's the only possible outcome in their terms? Postmodern, power is everything. The only possible outcome of peace is when you have a power so powerful it can put down every other power and you have peace. And the Romans called that the peace of despotism. And that's the left. That's the left. And they always end authoritarianism. Whereas Christian forgiveness, confront the evil through forgiveness, reconciliation. As Lincoln says, you can turn an enemy into a friend.
Yeah, very good.
That's an interesting insight that I think bears really careful consideration. Because what you're suggesting is that Christianity is both anti-utopian, right? That it acknowledges fault and shortcomings, and that can fit in the Christian worldview, but at the same time, it can, through repentance and ultimately forgiveness, can rectify the wrong. So it steers away from both the temptation of utopianism or hero worship or kind of glibly glossing over imperfections in the past and insisting on a kind of perfection, but it also makes possible avoiding a kind of descent into a kind of lamenting, fault-finding, and ultimately condemning of one's past. And to avoid both of those seems to be almost miraculous.
One of the great differences between the American Revolution and the French was utopian.
Correct.
The American Revolution, realistic. And this is where Witherspoon, Madison are so deeply biblical. You need separation of powers because we're rotten sinners.
Yes.
That's why you've got to be able to say no to power. Where in the French, well, I was born in China, as many of you know. Mao was utopian.
Yeah.
He was a painter and a poet who had a blank canvas. But as soon as you have a gap between the real and the utopian vision, that gap has got to be fulfilled.
Yes.
And so you fulfill it with force,
Yeah.
violence, coercion.
Yeah.
And he kills 75 million of his own people in the name of his utopian vision. So utopianism is incredibly costly.
Yes. I wonder, in your analysis, what is the role, really conceptual role, but it goes deeper than that, of heaven? Because in some respect, that's the locus of perfection. What's in our attempt to revitalize what needs to be revitalized, we need to simultaneously avoid this temptation to utopianism. How does the Christian's hope of heaven complement that, or season it, or direct it in the right way, so that we can have both an idea of perfection without falling prey to the idea that we need to instantiate that through politics or in our own social milieu?
Well, I would bring in the biblical idea, not just of heaven, but the Messiah. In other words, the idea that human effort will never finally do it.
Yes.
And as you move to the later prophets, they're all prophets of hope, but the later prophets, Zechariah and so on, hope is through a valley of catastrophe, whatever that's going to mean. We don't know. It's an extraordinary picture.
Yes.
But the coming of the Messiah, one who will do for us what we cannot finally do for ourselves. So you think of Martin Heidegger, the great German philosopher, atheist, his last interview, having wrestled with the dilemmas of humanity, only a God can save us now. Well, that's the requirement of the Messiah.
Yes.
And the great difference between our Jewish friends and us, they will say to him, Sir, is this your second time or your first time? But we both believe we can't do it on our own. We need God's intervention, messianic. And of course, heaven is the final fulfillment of that.
It's interesting you bring up Heidegger in that interview. Only a God can save us. He'd done so much reflecting on the modern problem of technology and so on. It seems that some of our most cutting-edge technologists are actually speaking as if a God will save us and we will create that thing that will save us. That there's a kind of...
But you also have, Heine, who is a friend of Karl Marx, calls Marx a godless self-god. A godless self-god. That's modern atheism.
Yes.
And Hobbes calls the state the mortal god state.
Yes.
So you've got godless self-gods in the individual level and mortal god states at the national level. Humans are trying to be as the Lord.
Yes.
And we know in Scripture that nothing makes the Lord more amused or mocks them than people who presume they're God. Some of you may have heard, there was an incredible speech recently by Tucker Carlson. He said he grew up Episcopalian, no Bible, except maybe a reference at Easter. He never read the Bible, but the last 2 years he started to take his faith seriously, and he just finished 2 years of reading the Bible for the second time. And he finished Revelation the week before. And then he said, I want to tell you what the Bible teaches me in one sentence. And I thought, are we going to have God loves you, or the fatherhood of God on the brotherhood of humanity, something thoroughly Protestant liberal platitudinous? He said, the Bible teaches us from end to end, God is God and we're not. And we better learn it. Oh, well.
Yeah. That's a pretty good catechism, isn't it?
It was terrific.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, though, there are many ironies in secularism. So they declared war on the Lord, they don't need him. All the post-Christian ideologies are quasi-religious.
Yes.
Marxism, Nazism, environmentalism, they're almost semi-religions. But you come to the pretension to be God, and you reach what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man. In other words, we thought we'd replace God.
Yeah.
We're looking at AI, maybe we're replacing ourselves.
Yes.
The ironies are there.
Yeah, very. And it's interesting when you think of ideologies in those terms, it suggests that perhaps the whole category of secular society is a misnomer,
That's right.
that it just doesn't work. You can try to fabricate such an illusion, but at the end of the day, it will be animated by something, and it will be a profoundly religious animation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
But the original idea, excuse me, seculum,
Yes.
was a Roman term for this world.
Yes.
Nothing wrong with that.
Correct.
This world. We live in this world. We eat bread.
Yep.
and we make love. Lots of things are thoroughly and material and secular.
Yeah.
But in the biblical view, that's only half.
Right, and
You have the supernatural
and
too.
the seculum is profoundly infused by the presence of God in that older sense.
So my mentor, Peter Berger, calls the secular world a world without windows. Plato's cave.
Yes.
And you can see today that many secularists themselves find it stifling and suffocating.
Yeah. That's interesting. It may, in fact, be a world without eyes rather than a world without windows, because the windows are things that we refuse to see. It might be a kind of self-blindness.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's fine. We're talking about how in a secular society, in a secular construct, there are attempts to create order by new rules, but yet there are borrowed categories that are constantly being used. To say that really every individual can choose their own version of right and wrong falls apart because it isn't logically consistent. Because if everything is potentially right, to make that work, then nothing is absolutely wrong. And I've never met anyone that doesn't believe that there are not things happening in the world that are absolutely wrong. And so even to try and make a secular construct work, they have to build on these borrowed categories of right and wrong. You should behave this way. You should care about these things. You should care about the environment, whatever it is. And I think it's just interesting that it comes back to that, because that's one of the gifts that Christianity is given to societies, is these distinct categories.
Yeah.
No, I often think secularism, put simply, is a protest against our Christian worst and a parasite on our Christian best.
It's good.
So they took over all the great things, progress, reason, and these things, and thought you could have them without the Lord. And they're discovering you can't.
Right. Well, even in your lecture, you talked about 3 roles of religion, essential roles of providing roots for greatness and providing parameters for restraint and giving grounds for renewal.
The 3 R's.
The 3 R's, there we go.
Don't change P's.
Okay. I was writing really fast, sorry. But that's exactly right. So if you decide that religion is no longer an option, or it should be done away with, you still have to deal with these things, and there are all these borrowed categories. It's good.
Well, why don't we turn to some questions? And faculty, as I said, you can have first crack. If there's anybody on the faculty who wants to ask a question, now's your time to dash to the microphone with full dignity. Dr. Jackson?
So I'm a little nervous because I'm standing here with an opaque drinking cup.
What's
And
in
now I have to
yours?
worry about appearances. In your talk this morning, you discussed the evangelical revival of England in the early 18th century, and how that was a multi-generational project to get through. For the people actually carrying that out, do you think that was driven more by people that had that multi-generational timeline, that were planning for long-term cultural change, or was that more driven by the compounding effect of individual actions in their own small spheres of influence adding together?
Very interesting question. I think only the Lord knows. My guess is the great majority were the second. People faithfully following their calling, whether they were preachers or whatever, without much thought, and so the long term was the relatively few. I was mentioning, and I'm ashamed to say I can't remember his name, I think it was Josiah Woodbridge, who at the end of the 17th century gave a vision of small groups and what became voluntary associations. His ideas were picked up quite deliberately and strategically by William Wilberforce, and that became the Clapham Circle and all that happened. Lyman Beecher picked up that and talked about that over here, and that was what Alexis de Tocqueville comments on as the power of American voluntary associations. Now, they were intentional, strategic, deliberate, thoughtful, with a sense of the generations, but I would guess that's only the tiny minority. Most people were just broadly being faithful.
You can imagine, though, Christendom produced great works of, say, architecture, and it takes a kind of multi-generational sensibility to build a cathedral.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the first stonemason who laid the first stone of whatever, of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris or wherever? Doing that act is a remarkable act of faithfulness.
And they were anonymous.
And they're not, who knows who they are.
Know.
But he was contributing to something he knew he would never see finished.
And in fact, his children and grandchildren
Yes.
might not see it finished yet.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. No, I was saying at lunch, I love the little phrase by Talleyrand, without individuals, nothing ever happens. Without institutions, nothing ever lasts. So we need both. But obviously most people, don't think in the long term, the strategic. No, cultures, the famous joke with Kissinger and Zhou Enlai. What did he think of the revolution? And the Chinese gentleman says, too soon to say. Chinese do think 5-year plans, 10-year plans, 50-year plans. America, the next election, the next business cycle. Americans think far too briefly.
Yeah.
Without history, without the world. We all ought to think globally. We can pray globally. And we should think, too, with as much of a sense of history as we possibly can.
Do you have any suggestions on how, or strategies, how young people who are sort of awash in, call it a culture of immediacy, can begin to cultivate this longer term sensibility that you're describing?
Well, history. I'm not a historian, but I love history. I imbibe history through biography. In other words, if you want to read the 17th century view of economics, it'd be deadly dull. But if you read it through some big crisis or some great general, or whatever, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
So I think read biography. What was Lewis's thing? Read 2 old books for every,
At least 2.
I'm a sociologist. You can't do that. But read as much history as you can, and the easy way to do it is great lives, inspiring or warning or whatever.
Yeah, that's good. Dr. Sillers.
Dr. Guinness, thank you for coming. Some have noticed a rising interest in eschatology in some circles. I'm just wondering how, as believers, our eschatology should shape how we approach our engagement with politics and civilizational questions, and what we lose if we don't pay enough attention to the doctrine of the Second Coming.
I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to plunge into the latest things between pre-mill, post-mill, and all that sort of stuff.
No, I don't want you to do that either. It's really about what do we lose if we don't pay attention to the Messiah, right, that Mark mentioned, and the doctrine of the Second Coming, and just the idea that we build civilizations, right, but that at some point there's going to be a second coming. How should that reality shape our building of these civilizations?
Well, Francis Schaeffer, to whom I owe a lot, he used to talk about the this is that fallacy. Now, people who read scripture, and in the 60s it was Hal Lindsey, everything, this is that. And of course, in my lifetime alone, I can't think of how many antichrists there have been. So Hitler was the antichrist, Kissinger was the antichrist at one stage, Saddam Hussein was the antichrist. They've come and gone, and people have identified wrongly. So we, I think, should never say, and our Lord starts talking in the passages about the end times, nobody knows except the Father. So I certainly don't know. But there are many things in our culture which are so profoundly challenging that you do think they're close to Zechariah or Mark 13 or Romans or Revelation or whatever it is. So for me, though, the challenge is hope. Our Guinness family motto is Spes mea in Deo. My hope is in God. And so I think we as followers of Jesus, we're conservatives. We fight to keep the very best that's been in the past. But we're not only conservatives. As I was saying earlier, we're the true progressives. We know where the future's going, and we know the best way to get there. And so the progressives, they don't give us the standard by which to judge whether it's progress or reaction. But we have standards to judge the way forward as well as to look at the past. So I think with hope, we're the tremendous progressives for the future. These are the sort of ways I think about it. So my great-grandfather was a close friend of the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, who was behind the Balfour Declaration, a lot of things like that. You know, he's the man, if you've ever been to London, Piccadilly Circus is a statue to him. And people think it's Eros. It's not Eros, the god of love. It's Anti-Eros, his brother, who is the god of caring and philanthropy and so on. Well, Lord Shaftesbury could actually say there had never been a half hour of his life, constant in battles, industry acts, in politics, there had never been a half hour of his life that he didn't think of the second coming of the Lord. Oh, wow. I'm certainly in nowhere near that. But for me, it's that hope, the messianic hope of justice and freedom and shalom and so on, which is inspiring going forward. So certainly I'm with you on that. Too many people take that down to arguments between pre-mill, post-mill, and so on. You know, I'm a little inclined to the theologian, I can't remember who said it first, that he was a pan-mill, not pre-mill or post-mill. Everything's going to pan out in the end. And, which is a little bit of a get-out, but there's no question that our hope in the Messiah, our hope in the Lord's return, gives us a tremendous dynamism to think about everything we're doing now. Thank you.
Dr. Zorzi.
Dr. Guinness, you gave us this wonderful framework of a civilizational moment that has to either renew or replace or decline, and you've applied that to Western civilization in general, and then especially to the United States. I was wondering if you could give us your analysis of current trends in the UK using that same framework.
If you go back, of the great revolutions, the English was the first. And so many of the best ideas that became the American Revolution you see in germ in the English Revolution and then carried over by the Puritans here, and they're what Alexis de Tocqueville calls the first American founding. But sadly, in England, the revolution failed. The king came back, so you had the continuation of those ideas, what became Whiggery, and that belief in liberalism, and what became the nonconformist conscience, which was very, very powerful, particularly in the 19th century. So England did have that continue, and then of course the revival made a tremendous contribution to bringing faith back into England. But in the 20th century, pretty well all downhill. And the most rapid secularization in Britain was Scotland, which used to be the most incredibly Christian country in the 19th century and has gone downhill faster even than England. So England's in a terrible situation now, where the Tories, who were in government for 13 years, didn't live up to any of their high conservative principles. And now you've got a Labour government, which is not only towards the radical left, but it's very dependent on groups like Muslims and so on. And so the English immigration has brought in no-go areas in the north of England and so on. English culture is really at a desperate point. And so you've got faithful churches, but the established church, the Church of England, led by an evangelical archbishop, has been a massive acculturation into, say, the sexual revolution. So there is no powerful Christian voice at the highest levels today. So I mentioned Christopher Dawson, his notion of soft totalitarianism, hard totalitarianism. He has an amazing book back in 1930 where he says the coronation is the most solemn commitment of a state to religion that you could conceive of, going back to Charlemagne and so on, the coronation oath. He said, but are we reaching the point where it's becoming a gigantic bluff? You have a power that's almost lost all power, committing itself to a faith in which no one believes any longer. He wrote that in the 1930s, and I think that's pretty well where England is now. In other words, short of a profound revival, England's in a tragically downhill situation.
Roger Scruton made a distinction between oikophilia.
What?
Roger Scruton made a distinction between oikophilia and oikophobia, and argued that the first is rooted in what he calls a culture of affirmation, but oikophobia, hatred of home, is a kind of rooted in what he called a culture of repudiation. And it seems that this idea of repudiating the very thing that we've inherited is sort of at the heart of this pathology that's tearing Western societies apart.
But that's at the heart of Marxism. So you read the Communist Manifesto,
Right.
the opening lines talk about that struggle.
Right.
And of course, now you have it in this country, the radical left has gaslit
Yes.
American history. Now, they are astute, they know the vulnerabilities. So the great Swiss historian Jakob Burckhardt, he says, if you have unaddressed evils left over unaddressed, they're kind of like a minefield after the war. Someone's going to walk on them,
Yeah.
or someone's going to set them off.
Yeah.
And so in Europe, the unaddressed is in Britain, class, or in Europe as a whole, colonialism. So you think of Frantz Fanon, post-colonialism. In America, it's obviously the great vulnerability is
It's race.
race.
Yeah.
And so they put the knife in that. Now, as people like Tom Sowell and others have said, the civil rights movement did an incredible job at righting wrongs, institutionally in other ways. But the residual thing was unaddressed, and so the left has put, I think America still has to address that. And I think only the cross and the atonement can do it. And I think part of 2026, there needs to be, this is shorthand, there needs to be an Ezra, Nehemiah style rededication to the first principles, as well as a Day of Atonement style addressing the evil. Because remember, the Day of Atonement wasn't because of personal sins, it was because of the national sin of the golden calf.
Yeah.
We have made the cross personal. My sin, your sin, her sin, his sin. No, who believes that the cross can atone for America's sins if Christians confess them that way? Do we? I'm not sure many do.
It does suggest that the central role of the church in that whole process.
Absolutely.
Sometimes we
No,
just
the
think
Day of
about
Atonement,
politics.
our Jewish friends,
Right.
you know, for us the cross is deeper than the Day of Atonement, but the Day of Atonement addresses the same thing, national
Right.
sins in solidarity.
That's good. Let's turn to questions from our students. Oh, we have one more professor.
Oh.
Two more. All right. One more. Dr. West.
Thank you, Dr. Guinness. This has been a wonderful discussion. My question has something to do with rhetorical framing. So towards the end of your lecture, you said something along the lines of those who believe that their fundamental principles are most worth defending are going to be those who win out in the end. And that, to me, evokes the framing of culture war, which has been with us for some time, right? At least since the 80s, we've been waging culture war in some form. And this was something that emerged in my group discussion is this a culture war to be fought in an aggressive way by Christians, or is this a period of persecution and hostility to be faithfully endured? And does that rhetorical framing make a difference in how we approach it as Christians?
Yeah, no, good question. The trouble with the culture war, and there is a culture war, no question, it has been politicized so that the whole focus has been on politics. And we need to remember politicization, the idea that politics is primary, came from the left. It's a very dangerous idea. The old maxim is far more important. The first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. In other words, the war we're fighting ranges from personal sharing of our faith with our neighbors in a loving, winsome way, to where we win them to the Lord, to times when we're in prayer and we're engaging the supernatural forces of darkness. And they're also part of that, because we're up against principalities and powers, which are not overcome in any election or by any vote, or as Chuck Colson used to say, the kingdom doesn't arrive on Air Force One. In other words, there is a culture war, no question. And politics is important. So I go around the country and people say to me, well, you know, things are bad, but I keep my head down, I'm faithful, I want to be like the early church. They won through by private faithfulness. And I would say that's dead wrong. The early church were faithful under a Roman dictatorship. You're in a republic based on the Hebrew Republic, and the essence of the Hebrew Republic is the reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. Every Jew responsible for every Jew, as they put it. Every American responsible for the American Republic. So for Christians not, say, to vote or get involved in politics is a failure of discipleship. Tocqueville calls the church schools of citizenship. Not because they made everything politics, but because it was an important part of their life where it was a matter. So the culture war is very important, but it's only part of a full range of the battle we're involved in, from personal things to supernatural things and so on. So yes, politics, but keep it in its place.
Very good. I'm going to turn to questions from students. So, like I said, we've got a
Do we clap
microphone.
them too?
We can clap for them. And we'll see who claps for them. I guess that'll be interesting.
Like American Idol, isn't it?
And you all don't need to, I mean, if you want to, I'll stand up, that's fine. But at least keep a few up there so
Oh,
we're
my
not
word.
waiting. And why don't we just give a universal applause to students who are standing up.
Ladies first.
Good morning, or afternoon now. Short. What is the homecoming we're striving for, and how do we achieve that through the institutions, for example, the church or the universities?
The church or the what?
The church or the universities.
We can't answer some of these. That's a very deep question, but we can't answer it in general without being highly simplistic or platitudinous. I would say, as again I was roughly saying at lunch, think through when you leave Patrick Henry, what are your gifts, your calling, your vision for your life? And your aim should be, in terms of what Oswald Chambers called, my utmost for his highest. Now that'll be different to you if you're going to be a homemaker or an NFL linebacker or a management consultant or a U.S. senator. It'll be quite different. But you need to think through the gifts God has given you, the calling and the vision he has for your life, and your utmost for his highest every day you live until you're... Peter Thiel gives us 120 years. Who knows? I don't think he will. But anyway, that's not the point. Every day of your life. Now think of it in that terms, not in some general thing. Because the general thing won't mean tuppence to you once you leave 5 years after Patrick Henry. But it'll be your daily life every day that makes the difference. You and your husband, eventually your family or whoever.
Okay, very good.
So Dr. Guinness, I just wanted to say thank you. I'm a senior that's graduating this spring. So this will be my last faith and
Lord
reason.
willing?
Yeah, Lord willing, yes, sir, yes.
Whoa, whoa.
Actually, Dr. Mitchell will have some say in that, actually. I'm running a DRW for him, so. But I just want to say thank you, sir. This is my last faith and reason, hopefully. So, this was a good one to end it on. So thank you very much for that. What I wanted to ask you, sir.
Dean made a very important point, because you've got leaders now who pronounce they're going to bring heaven on earth.
Yes, sir.
Solve wars in the days. And no.
Yes.
We all have to be humble. But Dean's kidding you, but
Yes, sir.
his point was an important one. Humility, God willing.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So I had a question for you. At the tail end of your lecture, you mentioned, we should ask the question, what made America great to begin with? And you said it wasn't the economy, which I thought was really, really relevant, because as a young conservative, I see a lot of people in the Republican Party that I've heard termed like Chamber of Commerce conservatives, where we're going to continue operating on the liberal secular framework because all that matters is lower tax rates or GDP, sort of winning the economic war with China or something like that. There's no push to return to first principles. So I was just wondering, what would be your prescription, politically speaking, for us as young Christian conservatives? Where should we go politically in the future?
Well, you want, on the one hand, be taking people, in other words, people who think we can do it through the military, we can do it through the economy. No. You've got to take them first back to what you see as the first principles of the American Republic. What do they mean? And then you, as a follower of Jesus, want to add to that by taking yourself and people you talk to back to the deeper principles of the Scriptures. Because that's what matters. Will America restore some of those essential Republican ideas? Now, you probably know, Alexis de Tocqueville says America has two foundings, the Puritans and the 18th century. Equally, you could say there are two ancestries to American freedom. One comes from the medieval common law tradition, things like Magna Carta and so on. The other comes from the rediscovery of the Bible. So the Reformation, 16th century, 17th century, historians call the biblical century. Why? Because they rediscovered what they called the Hebrew Republic. Sola Scriptura, back to the Bible. What had the church been since Justinian? The church had been hierarchical. It copied Roman structures. Rome had a Caesar, consuls, senators. Lo and behold, what did the church have? Popes, cardinals, bishops. They were a copy of Rome, hierarchical, based on power, structures. And it was Lord Acton, a Catholic layman, criticizing his own church, the Catholic Church, with the famous remark that all power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Why did the church produce the Inquisition? The problem, the fallacies of hierarchical power. The Reformation said no. And the Reformation wasn't just personal justification by faith. They wanted to see how the Bible said about everything. What is the biblical politics? Not hierarchical, it's covenantal. Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, Cromwell. The covenant in Exodus became the Constitution in America. The Mayflower Compact is a covenant. John Winthrop's speech on the Arbella is a covenant. When John Adams writes the Massachusetts Constitution, what does he call it? A covenant. What does Jefferson and Franklin, neither of whom were particularly biblical, what do they suggest as the great symbol? Symbols from Exodus. Americans need to remember how much of the American experiment is the American Republic copying the Hebrew Republic. So where's the first consent of the governed in history? Exodus. The master of the universe puts out his covenant. It's not ratified until 3 times the people say, all the Lord says, we will do. That's the origin of the consent of the governed. And you go on down the line. In other words, you won't understand the American experiment until you understand its roots in the Jewish experiment and so on. So explore that and get your fellow. Now, you can't say to many of your, say, secular young Republicans, we've got to look at the Bible. That turns them off. I would start with freedom. They all love freedom. But when you start to explore what freedom is, what freedom means, what freedom requires, you get back to concepts which are unashamedly biblical. You can't get by them. So be a prophet, pushing them back.
Very good.
And God bless you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Guinness, for your talk this morning. A question that came up in our discussion group was, in your opinion, has the Enlightenment had a net positive or a net negative on, like, the effects of the Enlightenment had a net negative or negative positive effect on our culture today and where we're going as a civilization?
Well, if we're talking about the Enlightenment per se, we should, and I certainly start to make clear, that there are different Enlightenments. So what I was talking about mainly rudely is the French Enlightenment. And that was the one most utopian and most radical. And that's the one behind Marxism and the left today. And that's the one that's extremely dangerous. Now, if you talk about the Scottish Enlightenment, it's different. You have atheists like David Hume, but you have many good people too, like John Reed. And so the Scottish Enlightenment at its best comes down through influence on John Witherspoon at Princeton, and therefore he was the teacher to so many, including James Madison. So you can say the good things too. But what I'm against, our spiritual challenge, is in Diderot. The Enlightenment, in one word, is reason. And that's the source of almost everything that went wrong. We believe in reason, but your day is faith and reason. In other words, reason by itself cannot justify itself. As I said, it cannot restrain the forces it unleashes. You need revelation from the outside. And the distinctive thing, if you look at all the world's religions, Eastern religions are very religious, Hinduism. Western atheism is very, very secular, anti-religious. But they all have an idea that all that is coterminous, including us humans, with nature, with the material. The great distinctive is Sinai. In other words, Judaism, the Christian faith. And as the great Cambridge philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein says, a Jew, the meaning of the system is outside the system. Transcendence is there. It's Mount Sinai, the burning bush, the burning mountain. It's transcendence that gives that Archimedean leverage by which history in the world and human nature can be changed. So thank God for the difference of Sinai. That's the best of the Enlightenment, but not the French style. The person who did this best, what's her name? Irving Kristol's wife.
Oh, Gertrude Himmelfarb.
Yes, Gertrude Himmelfarb has great stuff on this.
Thank you.
All right, we had a question. I think that you just briefly talked about this in your address to one of them, but it is, how do we convince the other side that the cultural fruit that they enjoy comes from the faith that they hate? How do we bridge that gap?
Very good question. And that's where we are today. And that's the reason you have, say, eminent historian like Tom Holland has come to faith in Jesus. Because as he looked at Western history and saw the gifts of the gospel, Judaism, the Christian faith, to the West, he realized that they were indispensable to the height of Western civilization, and the very critics of the faith are actually using those categories to attack the faith. Right. And that's how he came to faith. Now, he thought it through like that. A lot of people won't. And you have to sort of challenge them. What are you saying? What are you assuming? What's behind what you're saying? Where do you justify that? Now, that takes an apologetic argument. That's not easy to do, but it is the main reason. Cultural Christianity is not enough, but it's a wonderful halfway house. And it's actually saved many people from atheism and set them off on a path back to faith. So the leading, you think of 20 years ago, Dawkins and the Four Horsemen, how religion poisons everything.
Yeah.
Not at all now. You've got Tom Holland, Neil Ferguson, Ionesi Ali, and a whole number of others. They're very respectful about faith because they see it's indispensable, and as you put it rightly, even those who attack the faith use the weapons of faith. Now, there's a reverse side of that. I hope I'm not being perverse here. We're in a climate of postmodernism. Everything's power. But often the suggestion is the only way to overcome power is whatever it takes. In other words, to use power. And that's the way so many people, in terms of what Madison said, are going out to fight monsters and becoming monsters themselves in the process. Because they're using the weapons of the enemy as the only weapons they think that will overcome the enemy, and actually becoming more like the enemy than they realize. Whereas our Christian weapons of war are quite different. Not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, for example. And it takes love to overcome hate, and so on and so on. So we need to think through what it is we're doing. So there's a negative side, the unbelievers who are cheating by attacking us with things that are our weapons, really. But equally, we mustn't be seduced by being called to fight things that are wrong, actually in ways that are themselves only making things worse.
It's good advice. Next question.
Dr. Guinness, today you've talked about the reprieve that God has given the church and our new president. In light of this, my discussion group has this question for you. In your opinion, if electing a conservative president is a reprieve, how can we as the church achieve victory?
Well, good question. At the very least, thanking the Lord and confirming those parts of the conservative pushback that are good. They're good. But gently and humbly pointing out where they're not enough by themselves. We need deeper foundations if a real transformation is to take place. And that's where I think we have a tremendous amount we can witness to. Final changes have to be made in the human heart at the level of things like the family and so on. And there's nothing stronger than the Jewish and Christian faiths in doing that, in the Christian faith, in the transformation of people. So, I said the word freedom many times. Freedom, what are you going to celebrate in 2026? When Obama set up a commission on that 10 years ago, a friend of mine told me, he was on the commission, that many members of the commission were woke. What a farce. People with woke ideas celebrating the 250th, crazy. President Trump has taken that over, and in the announcement of he's going to do the Garden of Heroes, all sorts of things, he's going to have a massive celebration with his own leadership and with a huge amount of money behind it. Terrific. Far better than what would have been there before. But the genius of the Republic is in its notions of freedom. America wasn't founded as democracy, a republic of a certain type. Who's going to talk about that? They're very distinctive, and they happen to be profoundly biblical. And we need to do that, but I don't find many churches or pastors capable of it. Now, you're unusual. You have wonderful colleges like Hillsdale, more conservative, or wonderful colleges like you here at Patrick Henry. You have a unique responsibility because your education is all about these good things, which very few places are. I go around to a lot of the Christian colleges. They're sad. No, I mean, they're sad. The levels of wokeism here and there is just sad. Yours is different. So you hope the graduates of Patrick Henry will be in the vanguard of highlighting what's deeper and foundational and more important and possible, and so on. Well, put it another way. What people fear now, the decline of the West, the triumph of the axis of authoritarianism, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The growing trends, even in the West, are towards authoritarianism, creeping bureaucracy, you name it, the radical, and so on. The world is moving towards that massive coordination. What's the alternative? My hope and prayer is that you'll have people in this country, because you've got one of the best models of freedom coming from the scriptures, joining hands with brothers and sisters all around the world, and maybe even at one level a Jewish-Christian partnership, and together we might have the possibility of fighting for a human-friendly future. Your generation. Go for it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
It's a tough act to follow. Good afternoon, President Hay, Dr. Mitchell, and Dr. Guinness. Dr. Guinness, I think I speak for everyone here when I say that listening to you this morning, hearing your speech was an absolute honor and a pleasure, and it means a lot for you to come out here and invest your time in us to help us grow. My question dives into your idea of faith and seeking a people-friendly future. You spoke of civilizational moments and the dangers of a wayward culture that is without inspiration. It has been said, that the gates of Hades cannot prevail against the church. So what exactly is at stake if we lose this idea of inspiration and culture?
You can look at it various ways. Read Revelation. That's pretty tough. Clearly, with the later prophets of the Old Testament, Zechariah and so on, the path forward is not simple. It's through what looks like apocalyptic or catastrophic times. Daniel, Revelation. That's one way of looking at it. Another way would be to say what I said earlier. Europe, Christendom, is basically, I'm putting it bluntly, converted barbarianism. And Heine's great prediction, 1834, that if the cross, what he called the taming talisman that had gentled the Europeans, converted the barbarians, if it failed, the old gods of war like Thor would rise again and smash the cathedrals. Nazism. Below the veneer in Europe is not Confucian scholars and all that sort of stuff you had in China, barbarians. In other words, think of how World War II aggravated World War I. How many died in World War I? Well, 60 million in World War II. Now we know what total war is like. Now just think in your mind, what would World War III be like? In other words, if some of these things fail, I'm not a scaremonger. I'm not afraid at all. I've lived through the Chinese reign of terror. I'm not the slightest bit afraid. But you've got to start thinking of the alternative of some of these things. I was telling someone sent me a book. It's called Churchill's Citadel, which is a story of his little country home. And in the 30s, when he was a prophet in the wilderness, he was cold-shouldered by almost all of the country. He had fewer followers than you could put on one hand, and he invited people from all over the world to keep him in touch with what's going on. And he writes about the gathering storm. Well, if you're following trends today, it'd be very easy to point out the gathering storm, particularly to do with this, the dominance of power everywhere. But so you can see what will come unless we choose rightly. That's why your generation is so important, because now, when I first came to this country, 68, the Long March, something incredible happening, but the counterculture, my first book was on the counterculture. It was still, for most people, relatively small and out there in the fringes, California, youth and so on. But now, when you saw, say, the Hamas protests, and you saw that convergence of radical Islamism and radical Marxism, both of them hating the West, do you not see the writing on the wall? In other words, if we don't count the cost, make the right choices, you can spell out what may come. I'm not going to predict anything. You know, predictions are successful when they come true. Prophecies, when they come true, are a failure, because prophecies are a warning. Biblical prophecies, they're a warning.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Guinness, for the speech. My question is primarily about history. You talked about the results of the Protestant Reformation and what that did to the institution of the church. So my question is, to what extent do you think the Second Great Awakening, which democratized American Christianity and kind of attacked the authority and institution of the established church in America, is responsible for the post-Christian culture we see today?
Every movement has a downside. So yes, you could say that. There was a downside to that. But there were so many other factors. And I think a far more serious one, you know, from the call of Abraham onwards, the great alternative to faith is idolatry and going the way of the people around us, whether it's kingship or the idols they worship or whatever. So we're called to be faithful and to be countercultural. And so you had a type of faith that acculturated itself. And again, the Jews say, you look at the lost 10 tribes, northern Israel, they literally, in the Jewish terms, acculturated themselves into oblivion. They're lost. They're gone. And so is all that part of the church that tried to copy the spirit of the age and became submitted to it. The Episcopal Church in this country is a dying church. Tragically, the Church of England, led by an evangelical archbishop, going the same way. They're acculturating themselves into oblivion. That's much more the problem that we're talking about. So you've got to be faithful without picking up the ways of the world around you, so we're faithful to the Lord. So yes, you can look at any movement and see it has a downside, a plus side, minus side, and so on. But so do we all. So do we all. I might sound good on my day, but if you knew me, I've got terrible downsides. You may have one or two yourself, I don't know. So yes, make your point about that, but look at other things too, and that worldliness, the acculturation to the world. You look at evangelicals. You know, when I first came here, 68, I was here for 6 weeks. I met a lot of Christian leaders. I only met one man, Carl Henry, who founded the Christianity Today, who really understood what was going on in the 60s. Most evangelicals were shocked or outraged or whatever. They literally slept through the 60s and woke up in 73 with things like Roe v. Wade. Then came the evangelical popularity, Born Again, Chuck Colson, Jimmy Carter. And there's a huge infusion of worldliness. Seeker-sensitive, we must be like, and so on. Evangelicalism is largely acculturated to the world today. That's the problem. So yes, you're right. There are downsides to any great movement, but always look at ourselves today in the same way. Our strengths and our weaknesses.
Thank you, Dr. Guinness.
Thank you for your talk today, Dr. Guinness. One thing that came up was that when we discussed the issue of the decline of the West, there's sort of an issue of what and when the turning point was, and we get everything from, you know, William of Ockham to rationalism to extreme empiricism to skepticism and Kant. What shift exactly are we fighting?
Only the Lord could answer that one. There are probably 100 shifts, or 1,000, I have no idea. Maybe the shift could be next week when you stop praying for the West and think you can do it by thinking or political action. I have no idea. In other words, you can see turning points in history, but I wouldn't ever have a crack at that one. I'm not the Lord. We are, John Isaac Newton, a child playing on the edge of an ocean with sand pebbles. Our knowledge at best, if you take a Leonardo's knowledge, and still puny compared with what the Lord knows. And think of the complexity of history and human nature. Each of us, with our decisions we make, temptations we avoid or succumb to. The Lord only knows which are big, which are full. Who knows? What we do know is it's surprising. I mean, you take great people in our time. Has there been a greater Christian leader than Billy Graham? But maybe some little lady praying in Louisiana was far more powerful a kingdom than Billy. I have no idea. The Lord knows. So all you've got to worry about is what you face and the turning points and the decisions that you make and your friends. And one thing I'd say is that none of us can do this alone. So Wilberforce had a handful around him, the Clapham Circle. Yeah, my wife and I have had the privilege of about half a dozen friends, not all in the same town. Some of them yes, some of them no. But over the course of 50-odd years of our marriage, they've been our friends, counselors, critics, supporters, encouragers, and so on. Make sure when you pray the Lord will give you those people. Some of them will be here with you at Patrick Henry. Some will be meet others. But all your life, you have your own calling, and you need a group of friends around you because you can't do it by yourself. We can't be ourselves by ourselves. We need families and so on. But we can't follow callings by ourselves. So, for example, many fellowship groups have wonderful prayer, wonderful Bible study, zero sense of what their callings are. But if you're in a fellowship group with, say, 6 or 12 other people, you should know what each of the brothers and sisters' sense of callings are. So you can encourage them, affirm them, sometimes criticize them, hold their feet to the fire. We get ground down. Everything's against us. Our friends can put us back on track and put the fire in again. So pray that the Lord will give you that small group and make sure that the turning points in your life can never be put down either by the evil one or by the Lord himself as more significant than you think. I couldn't answer your question.
That was an outstanding answer.
A great question.
Thank you, Dr. Guinness. My question from my group is, when talking about civilizational renewal, how do we use faith as an end in and of itself rather than just as an instrument to civilizational renewal? So how do we pursue Christianity for itself, but then also use that pursuit to impact our civilization around us?
Well, let's be absolutely clear. The Christian faith is not utilitarian. The Christian faith is not a program for civilization or for civilizational renewal. That would be idolatry, and it quite simply wouldn't work. Think of Martin Luther's great phrase, "Let God be God." If you glorify the Lord and make your faith in him the prime motive as far as you can for all that you're doing, your thinking, your action, and so on, good behavior will be the byproduct. You won't be thinking, I want to be a good... No. You'll be honest, you'll be loyal, you'll be loving, etc. Equally, good citizenship will be the outcome. Einstein used to say that things should be as simple as they can be, but no simpler. The foundations of American freedom are incredibly simple. Where you have a high faith society, you have a high truth society. Where you have high truth, you can have high trust, and you will have freedom. Low faith, low truth, low trust, you'll have to have laws, regulations, and surveillance everywhere. The essence of postmodernism, which is no truth, all power, you have what they call the hermeneutics of suspicion. I have power interests, you have power interests, and my only way of protecting myself is to suspect you. Solzhenitsyn said that under Stalin, suspicion was the worldview. We're going that way. We have to be cynical to protect ourselves. We have to suspect everyone in case. That's absolutely deadly. Now, there's nothing that sounds so simple. To be truth, do not bear false witness. You can't have justice unless truth is established. Some of these things are so simple, we've got to have the courage to say the simple things all over again. And loving the Lord and living his way, you will be a person of freedom and justice and truth. But you're not aiming for that. The Christian faith is not a program. You're loving him, and let the chips fall where they may, and the chips will fall well.
Thank you.
We have a handful of more questions in about 11 minutes, so we'll see what we can do.
All right.
So,
I need some more Johnny Walker in my glass.
Waiter.
Thank you again, Dr. Guinness, for speaking to us today. It's been a privilege to hear your thoughts. Your point that religion is central to the solution to the problem that we face today is very well taken. There are many people who agree with your solution, but they have landed on many different answers. You have a unique perspective on this coming from the UK. Many people have found an answer in Eastern spirituality, or they found an answer in moralistic therapeutic deism, or westernized neo-paganism, or whatever it is that Jordan Peterson believes. And so I would like to ask you what we as Bible-believing Christians should do with these halfway solutions.
Do with what?
With these halfway solutions.
Well, apologetically, differences make a difference. And contrast is the mother of clarity. So depending on what we're talking about, there's almost no question in the West that if we're to have a human-friendly future, one thing you have to have is a high view of human worth. So what are the words of your American Declaration of Independence? I won't put the dean on the spot. We hold these truths to be self-evident, any of you?
All men are created equal.
No. For Jefferson, self-evident. That would be nonsense to Plato. Some men are born gold, some men are born silver, some men are born bronze. For Aristotle, some are born to be ruled, some to rule. For the Hindus, some are born Dalits and some are born Brahmins. In other words, it sounds good, you talk about human dignity. All right, how do you ground it? Only in the faith, Judaism, the Christian faith, do you have that high view of human worth. That's the foundational one. You move down to other things like truth. When people realize that without truth, we're all manipulable by power. We're in the world of dictators. But where do you establish truth? Jean-Paul Sartre, you can't have truth unless someone has an infinite knowledge of everything. Oh, that's the Lord. And you've gone down the line. In other words, the differences make a difference. So Jefferson, if you believe in 20 gods or no gods, it doesn't pick my pocket or break my legs. Yes, the government has no business saying what you believe. Yes, Jefferson's half right. But if he thinks that any belief goes, that's totally wrong. Because, as I say, you look at historians of civilization, you've got to put in lots of factors. The Nile for Egypt, geography makes a difference. Climate makes a difference. Israel, Golda Meir's joke, Moses led us all over the Middle East and landed up in the one place, no oil. Israel's a very distinctive country. They came from Egypt where, the Nile gave them incredible fertility every year. In Egypt, if the rain didn't fall, you were in trouble. You had to pray and so on. So climate geography makes a terrific difference, but what is the ultimate difference is the philosophy that answers the basic questions of life. And obviously, the deepest are all religious, except for secularism, which doesn't do a good job. So challenge people. What are the deepest issues of existence, and what answers those best? And then put the things like human dignity, freedom, justice, truth, and so on, get them to answer. And they'll soon be in trouble.
Thank you.
Very good.
Hello, Dr. Guinness. It has been said before me, and at the risk of sounding repetitive, I want to say thank you, and it was certainly a privilege to hear from you. But the question that I want to ask on behalf of our group is, what are the trends and patterns of past civilizations that signaled their imminent fall and deterioration into ruins, like you talked about, like Greece and Rome, for instance. And what makes you say that this generation, our generation, is in our critical civilizational moment?
Previous civilizations, I mean, some collapse overnight. And the best book on that, and I've forgotten the title for the minute, is Victor Davis Hanson's recent book. Do you remember that? What's it called? His new book. He talks about Thebes and others that have literally, someone Google it now. What?
It's the end of everything.
The end of everything. Those are civilizations that collapse almost overnight. But for most, no. And obviously the classic is Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of Rome. But for those of us who are Christians, our classic is, we've got a double Christian classic. One, the prophets. So obviously the collapse would be 587, and the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans, and all the prophets leading up to that, from Amos and so on, right through Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. And that's an incredible description of what happens. You have idolatry, you have corruption, and then you have the oppression of the poor. And at a certain point, the Lord judges it. Obviously, another classic that's Christian, not biblical, is St. Augustine's The City of God. And he's describing the Roman Empire in its last days. And as you know, the Vandals were at the gates of his city when he died. And so whether it's Gibbon, an atheist, or the Hebrew prophets, or St. Augustine, we should look at these great classics, and you can say the decline of civilization is usually clearest at the sunset. Mm-hmm. Now, with ordinary sunsets, the sun is most glorious and colorful in its sunset. And you can see many of the best books on this are describing the sunsets. So read them. Well, you've got, I'm trying to remember, the Oxford novelist, I loved it. I think it's Ian Pear's The Dream of Scipio. Because he tells the story, it's fictional, and I read it 20 years or so ago, so I'm not very immediate in my mind. He tells the story of 3 different periods of decline and what it was like to live in that. And it is sobering, because we're living in such a time unless the Lord sends us the revival that we pray for.
Okay, thank you.
We are just a couple minutes away from being done, so we might get a couple questions in.
Well, I'll answer more briefly.
Okay, all right.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Guinness. My question seeks to dig into some of the granular implications of the wonderful philosophical explanation that you've just given of our civilizational moment. So there's 2 ways to give the question. The first is, what is one practical thing we can do to affect the change that you see as necessary? And there are 4 areas that are practical for us at PHC that come to my mind: in academia, in economics and business, in the church, for those of us who want to go into theology, and lastly, in politics. Another way to put it is, if you had 4 of us in front of you who you were advising on going into those careers as Christians listening to this talk, what is the piece of advice that you would give each of them for their particular careers?
I told him I'd be brief. You
Calling.
asked 4 huge questions in your brief question.
Yeah.
But what I would say to you in essence, and I need to know you better to do it, my dear brother, think through your gifts. Ask yourself, what is your calling in life? Whether tomorrow in your studies, I don't know whether you're a liberal arts major or a mathematics genius or going to go into engineering. What are your gifts? What are your calling? And what are you doing now to be your utmost for the Lord's highest, right where you are? And if you leave Patrick Henry with all that in play, and with friends who will encourage you and affirm you in the same, then please the Lord, you'll be in 60 years' time, as I'm 60 years on from my being where you are. You'll have done extraordinary things for the Lord, which you have no idea of today. And if I was to say, think this, you would have left that behind 50 years ago with the great things you've transcended them with. So I would just say to you, learn the gifts God has given you uniquely. Think through your calling and how you can be your utmost for His highest every day with the encouragement of a group of friends, and then go for it for the next 65 years.
Thank you, Dr. Guinness.
One more question.
Oh, sorry.
This will be the last one.
Dr. Guinness, you discussed the Christian vision for a human-friendly future. The progressive left champions a similar goal with a different vision. How can we demonstrate that the progressive humanist view of nature is actually not humane?
Well, I often say, I've got to be brief, the radical left, cut it short. Their revolutions never succeed, their oppressions never end, and their futures never arrive. That's what I would say bluntly. Now, each of those you could spend an hour on. The visions of the left have ended well nowhere. So as with all apologetics, C.S. Lewis used to say, press them out to the absolute ruddy end. Very English way of putting it. Francis Schaeffer used to say, push them to the logic of their presuppositions. Or Elijah on Mount Carmel, he doesn't say come back to God. He says, if Baal is God, follow Baal. Knowing that when they try, they can't. And that is a key part of our logic. The gospel is good news to people in a bad situation. And many people don't realize the bad situation they're in until they realize that the end of the line of their own ideas is hitting the wall and the bad situation. So you've got to learn to say, all right, you're this, you're that, you believe this, that, the other. Where does it lead to? And only when they begin to see that, not a moment before, there's a better way. There's good news. In fact, we'd say it's the best news ever. Good place to end.
Amen.
Thank you, sir.
It's a great place to end. Thank you, Dr. Guinness, for showing us so clearly in your words how to winsomely present the truth and to stand up for it faithfully. Please join me in thanking Dr. Guinness. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.